Welcome to the presentation of the study on voluntourism. I'm Mariah Michelle with
Stephen Trump and Dan Miller.
We titled our study, Give a Little, Gain a Lot, because as we learned, when you go on a volunteer vacation, you may give a little more than a regular vacation, but you gain so much more from it. Our partners, Planetera, Gap Adventures, and the International Ecotourism Society have to be thanked because this study would not be possible without them. To go over what we're going to talk about today, we'll start off with a background and our purpose and objectives. We'll speak a little bit to our approach and then move right into what we found. After that, we'll talk about what it all means, go through our suggestions for our partners, and explain how this is just the beginning.
So a little bit of background. From what we found, voluntourism is a relatively new concept, but it's growing exponentially fast, with a 780% growth in a 5-year period between 2003 and 2007. In addition to that, we found that there are 146 voluntourism organizations worldwide. But with the fact that it's a relatively new concept, it's also a new concept in the academic literature. But from what we know from previous research is that there's been a lack of quantitative research. Most of the research on voluntourism has been conducted in a qualitative manner, and it's utilized a small sample size. We found that motivations to volunteer abroad are also mixed. Researchers haven't really been able to nail down whether there are motivations for volunteering abroad or whether there aren't. In addition, current volunteerist expectations are formed from an organization's promotional advertisements, and there's a lack of research on prospective volunteerists. Now, for the purpose of this study, we're going to define current volunteerists as people that have gone on previous voluntourism vacations and have come back, whereas prospective volunteerists are people that have not gone but have an interest in volunteering abroad. So, from the insight that we've gained from previous research, we've come up with a purpose for this study, which was to examine the attitudes and perceptions of current and prospective volunteerists. Now, in order to achieve this purpose, we had to come up with some objectives. The first one being to examine the motivations that people have for volunteering abroad. So really finding out what drives them to volunteer abroad. To analyze current and prospective volunteerist expectations. To explore current volunteerist satisfaction with their past experiences. To determine how current and prospective volunteerists choose a travel organization. And finally, to get an overall profile of current and prospective volunteerists.
Our approach. To achieve our objectives, we designed a multi-phased mixed methodology. First phase was a descriptive conclusive survey. This was administered online, and 1,073 current prospective volunteerists were surveyed. Phase 2 was a series of exploratory individual in-depth interviews. This was administered on Skype and had 8 interviews with a mix of current and prospective volunteerists. So how was it done? This survey was designed by Lime Survey, an online survey design software. There were 2 emails sent out. The first one was to invite respondents, and the second was a reminder email. Emails were sent to approximately 3,000 Planetera members, approximately 3,500 Gap Adventure members, and approximately 17,500 TIES members. Response rates were 7%, 5%, and 3% respectively. This was also promoted using Facebook and Twitter. The survey was launched February 18th and closed March 6th. The individual in-depth interviews were conducted by having a portion of the online survey at the end asking respondents whether they would like to participate in further research. These respondents were aged 20 to 29, as those was the age cohort with the highest majority within the study. There were 5 current and 3 prospective volunteerists, 6 female and 2 male.
Now for the good stuff. What did we find? We had respondents from nearly 100 countries around the world, which is indicated here by the green shading, which shows countries that had at least one respondent. We grouped these respondents into 8 regions in order to do further analysis with them. As you can see, the greatest proportion of respondents came from the United States of America, Canada, Asia, and Europe. When we discuss regional differences, we will not be including South America, Mexico, or Central America due to the small sample size. We did not include these because we wanted to maintain data integrity. These respondents were 1/3 current voluntourists. They are also mostly female, being a 60-40 split in gender. We had respondents from ages 14 to 60 plus, with the largest proportion being 20 to 39. As I discussed in the last slide, we will not be including the age cohort 14 to 19 because of the small sample size in an effort to maintain data integrity. Voluntourists are very avid travelers. When we asked them how many international vacations they had taken in the last 5 years, over 1/3 of them indicated they had taken 5 or more. Voluntourists are very educated. 85% of them were university or college educated or more. Although we had a wide range of marital status, the largest proportion were either married or single, with 1/3 each. Past research has shown that the most popular destination for volunteering is South America. This is consistent with our findings that name that as the most popular destination, followed by Central America, Africa, and Asia. When we dove into this further, we found that there were some regional differences. For example, respondents in Africa and Asia primarily wanted to volunteer in their region alone, while respondents in Canada and Europe did not want to volunteer in their region. We found overall there was an interest in all the regions to volunteer in, but the United States of America had the respondents with the most diverse interests. As this volunteerist from Canada states, she'd go anywhere that's safe. So what did they want to do when they got there? This quote is great at showing the interest in diverse projects. As seen here, the list of projects we asked on our survey, the top being environmental conservation, community tourism projects, community development, and wildlife. Overall, there was interest in all the projects we listed. And although there were some regional differences among ages, genders, and current versus prospective, all respondents agreed in the top 4 choices. We really wanted to understand what factors influence a volunteerist's decision to volunteer abroad. This quote is great at showing that there are a wide range of motivations. The graph shown here shows the top 7 factors that influence this decision. This is consistent with past research that showed that interaction with locals, helping others, and cultural immersion as very strong factors in this decision to volunteer abroad.
Four types of volunteerists. While there's currently an ongoing debate within the literature, some believe that there is no definitive way to discover the motivations of volunteerists, while other research points to having either 2 groups, volunteer-minded and vacation-minded tourists. So who's right? In our research, we used a technique called factor analysis, which grouped 14 different statements about motivations from the survey based on commonalities. From this analysis emerged 4 specific profiles. We named them the altruistic volunteer, the local volunteer, the definitive volunteerist, and the adventure tourist. Let's take a closer look at the altruistic volunteer. The altruistic volunteer had a number of motivational statements that were significant. These were the interaction with locals, helping others, cultural immersion, education, and environmental sustainability. These are summed up nicely by a prospective volunteerist from China, who says, in order to lend a hand, you have to get in touch with the local people. And I think volunteerism is one way to do that. The local volunteer. Motivations that were significant to this profile were internship opportunity, family volunteer options, organized activity, physical activity, and developing friends. The reason why this particular profile is called the local volunteer is explained later with further tests that we ran. These statements were summed up nicely from a current volunteerist from Italy. You don't need to travel far to volunteer. Even people here in a city like Rome need help sometimes. The definitive volunteerists. Of the 14 motivational statements, 2 showed up as significant for this profile. They were project location and type of volunteer work. This is summed up nicely by this quote from prospective volunteers from Croatia. I hate heat and humidity. Everywhere the temperature is reasonable, I would go there. I wouldn't go somewhere to build a house or anything. I would go to do medicine. The context of this quote is that this particular prospective volunteerist was practicing medicine, so the 2 important things for him were where the location of the volunteerism was occurring and the type of work he was doing. The adventure tourist. Motivations that were significant to this profile were adventure, international travel, and physical activity. This is summed up nicely by this quote from a current volunteerist in Canada. Africa, the place I volunteered, was cool because it was a total different experience. At the end of the trip, we got to go on a 2-day safari. We were so close to lions, and my sister got kissed by a giraffe. Now we take a look at the demographics of the 4 typologies. We ran additional tests to see who would most likely fall into each of these profiles. We found that response from Europe, Australia, and South Pacific were most likely to fall under the altruistic volunteer, while prospective volunteerists, males, and respondents from Africa and Asia were most likely to fall into the local volunteer. It should be noted that respondents from Africa and Asia rated international travel as not very important, so these particular respondents preferred to stay within their local region, hence named the local volunteer. The definitive volunteerist had current volunteerists, males, and respondents not with children. Respondents from Canada, United States of America, those not couples with children, and not married couples were significant to the adventure tourist.
So now that we have an understanding of volunteerist motivations in general, we want to take a look at their expectations. So, from this question, we asked, how long would you be willing to travel abroad for? And an overwhelming 98% indicated that they wanted to travel for over a week, with only 2% indicating that they wanted to travel for less than a week. Now, when we dive a bit further into the data, we find that there's differences between current and prospective volunteers. So, if we look at, in particular, the portion on this graph that selects that they want to travel for over a month, we see a large difference between current and prospective volunteerists, with 46% of current volunteerists indicating that they wanted to travel for over a month, with only 29% of prospective volunteerists indicated they wanted to travel for the same amount of time. Similarly, we looked at regional differences throughout the world, and we found that, in general, over half of respondents from Australia, South Pacific, Africa, and Europe were willing to travel for over a month, with less than a third of respondents from the United States, Asia, and Canada willing to travel for the same amount of time. So you can see that there's a large disparity between these two main groups. Another question that we asked was what portion of their travel experience would they like to devote to volunteering? And in general, respondents wanted to devote 40 to 80% of their trip to volunteering, as indicated by this graph. In addition, we found that there was differences between current and prospective volunteerists, with current volunteerists indicating that they wanted to devote a higher percentage of the travel experience to volunteering. And when we look at the amount of hours per day that they wanted to volunteer, we found that in general it was similar. They wanted to volunteer between 4 to 8 hours per day. And similarly to the previous graph in which we showed the percentage of time they wanted to devote to traveling, or to volunteering, we found that current volunteerists actually wanted to devote a significantly more amount of hours per day to volunteering than prospective volunteerists. For cost and accommodation, in general, people indicated a willingness to pay less than $1,500 on their volunteerism experience, and this is in Canadian dollars. But when we look at accommodation, we find that 56% of volunteerists do not have a preference in the number of people that they actually work with. In addition, we looked at accommodation, and there was a similar percentage, with 43% of respondents indicating that they did not have a preference in where they would be staying.
Now we take a look at how the prospective and current volunteers chose travel companies. The majority of factors were important to the majority of people. The most important factors were experience of the company, reputation of the company, price of the trip, and knowing where your money is going. These four were rated over 80% importance. Roughly 40% of respondents stated family volunteer options, travel agency recommendations as most important factors.
So when we take a look at satisfaction, we wanted to know how satisfied they were with their actual volunteerism experience. So one of the questions that we asked to gauge this was, would they recommend a voluntourism vacation to a friend? And the overwhelming majority, 82%, stated that they would likely recommend a volunteer vacation to a friend. The second question that we asked to gauge satisfaction was whether they would go on another volunteerism vacation. And an overwhelming 87% indicated that they would likely go again, with only 2% indicating that they would not likely go on another volunteerism vacation. And this is the quote that we saw at the beginning of the presentation, which states, when you do volunteer work, when you come back, you have something more in your heart. And this really speaks to the volume of this study, and in general sums up our results for current volunteers. So what it all means, we basically found out through the factor analysis that there's 4 types of volunteerists, and not all of them are motivated by the same ideas or interests. The 4 types were the altruistic volunteer, the local volunteer, the definitive volunteerist, and the adventure tourist. We found that these respondents were also highly engaged with the topic. People were willing to go almost everywhere in the world, do almost any kind of work, and in addition to that, current volunteerists were even more engaged than prospective volunteerists, with current volunteerists wanting to go for a longer amount of time, devote a higher percentage of their trip to volunteering, and volunteer more hours per day in respect to prospective volunteers. In addition to that, we found that 87% wanted to go on another volunteerism vacation, and one of the things that came out of the research that was surprising was the amount that people actually wanted to talk about their experiences, with 51% of current volunteers indicating an interest in talking about their previous travel experiences in an interview scenario. Now, we also gauged an overall respondent profile, and in general we found that the majority were younger in age, from 20 to 29, and they've been to almost 100 countries. We had respondents from almost 100 countries throughout the world. They were highly educated, the majority were either single or married, and they were avid travelers, as Mariah stated earlier.
We came up with a few suggestions for our partners. The first would be to provide a range of volunteering options and packages that target 4 types of volunteerists. We found that these 4 types are defined by their difference in motivations, and designing a variety of volunteer vacations would satisfy those differences. One size does not fit all. Respondents in different age groups, regions, current versus prospective, and genders express differences in terms of motivations and expectations, and therefore designing a variety of types of volunteer vacations in terms of duration, accommodation, types of projects, and regions would ensure that there's a trip for every volunteerist. As Dan spoke, these volunteerists are very engaged and keen to talk about their experiences. Finding ways to capture these personal experiences in terms of marketing would be very effective and efficient, as their reflections are positive and they have an overall willingness to talk about them. Finally, we found that one of the most important factors for choosing a travel company was knowing where their money was going. Making it as clear as possible, the breakdown of the trip cost would ensure that volunteerists feel comfortable and willing to spend the money necessary to embark on a volunteer vacation.
Now what I want to impress upon you is that this is just the beginning. By conducting this research, we have found that there are a number of future research opportunities. First, seek to understand baby boomers. Past research has indicated that a large number of volunteerists fall in this age cohort. As particularly in Canada and the United States, as the baby boomer cohort swells, these particular potential and current volunteerists have more discretionary income and time to volunteer. Further research should be noted. Further qualitative analysis needed across additional age cohorts. In our particular study, we focused for the qualitative portion on respondents aged 20 to 29 as they formed the majority of our study. Future research should take a look at the expectations, motivations, satisfaction of prospective and current volunteerists from the age cohorts 30 to 39, 40 to 49, and so on until the baby boomers. Analysis of online forums. Through the qualitative phase of our research, response demonstrated a high level of engagement in the qualitative portion and indicated high interest in sharing their experiences through online forums. This can be used to fuel qualitative research to better understand the members of prospective and current volunteerists. Understanding similarities and differences of the four types of volunteerists. In our factor analysis, we took a look at the four typologies and how the demographics relate to them. Further research should take a look at the preferences, expectations, and satisfaction as they relate to these four types.
Any questions can be forwarded to the International Ecotourism Society, and we thank you for your time.